4. The Gustav gun. In order to invade France and advance into the rest of Western Europe, Adolf Hitler needed to get past a 280-mile line of concrete fortifications called the Maginot Line, which ran along the French border with Italy, Switzerland, Luxembourg, and Belgium. It was built in order to force the Nazis to go around the line and through the incredibly dense Ardennes forest, which the French believed was impossible. At first, the Germans didn't consider going around the Maginot Line to be a viable option either, so they set their sights on figuring out how to cross through it without suffering enormous casualties. One idea that Hitler came up with was to create a railway gun that was powerful enough to pierce the fortifications. By the time this vision came to fruition in 1941 as the Gustav gun, France had already fallen due to the development of powerful tanks that were capable of barreling through the Ardennes forest. But the Nazis saw other good uses for the weapon, so development continued. Measuring 4 stories high and 155 feet long, the Gustav gun was the largest calibered rifled weapon ever used in combat. Also called the Schwere Gustav or the Heavy Gustav, it weighed 1,350 tons and had a 100-foot-long barrel that measured 31 inches in diameter. The Germans developed the weapon based on the philosophy of the bigger, the better, which had dominated military technology around the world for centuries. More specifically, it came following decades of increasingly large railroad guns among the planet's superpowers. Its design was largely inspired by a German-built long-range artillery piece that was created during World War I called the Paris gun, which struck the famed French capital with 243-pound shells from 75 miles away. The Gustav gun was first used in the 1942 Siege of Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula, where the Germans fought the Soviet Union for control of the Sevastopol port along the Black Sea. During the battle, the Gustav gun fired 300 shells. While it was capable of causing great damage, the gun came with numerous disadvantages because of its size. It was an easy target for Allied overhead bombers and could only be moved along a specialized railroad that had to be built in advance. The Gustav gun took 4 days to assemble, hours to calibrate, and required hundreds of men to operate it, and it could only fire a maximum of 14 shells per day. Technology advanced rapidly throughout the conflict, and by the time the colossal weapon was developed, railroad guns were quickly becoming obsolete. Only 2 Gustav guns were ever made, and the Nazis stopped using them a year after the first one was produced, and eventually they were scrapped entirely. 3. Electromagnetic railguns. In 2005, the US Navy began working to develop a futuristic weapon called the Electromagnetic Railgun, or EMRG, which uses no gunpowder, but instead relies on electromagnetism to fire its projectiles. Unlike most conventional large guns, which often require a full team to operate, an EMRG only needs 1 operator. The technology is surprisingly basic. Simply put, powerful electrical currents generate magnetic fields, which accelerate the projectile along 2 rails. The Navy spent more than 15 years and $500 million working to develop its railgun, which is capable of striking targets 124 miles away at speeds of up to 1.6 miles per second. It was at least 3 times as fast as existing weapons, and while each projectile came with a $25,000 price tag, it was much cheaper than a missile round of the closest comparable capabilities. It would seem crazy not to jump all over the opportunity to have a weapon that's cheaper and easier to use. The EMRG was also proven not to jam and had a greater range than conventional guns. However, there are some issues with the electromagnetic railgun that have prevented it from becoming a standard issue fixture of any and all US naval warships. The main problem is that the amount of power the weapon requires is greater than most modern warships can provide. For years, there were rumors of the Navy abandoning the project, but military officials denied this and continued to hype up the program until 2021. This was when the Navy pulled the plug on its funding for the railgun as well as the 3-foot-long projectile that was being developed for the weapon. By then, China had also started designing its own electromagnetic railgun. And while the US began to see a lack of usefulness for the weapon, China took the idea and ran with it, and has since claimed to develop the world's most advanced EMRG. According to a US intelligence report, the country plans to equip its naval ships with electromagnetic railguns as early as 2025. In 2020, CNBC reported that China's EMRG is supposedly capable of striking targets 124 miles away at a speed of up to 1.6 miles per second, which would put it on par with the capabilities of the American version of the weapon. At that speed, a projectile could travel from New York City to Philadelphia in less than a minute. China's electromagnetic railgun has reportedly reached the sea trial stage, meaning it surpassed the American project, which was ditched during the research and development phase. The US Navy has now turned its focus to hypersonic missiles, amid growing pressure to keep up with similar weapons that are being developed by China and Russia. In early 2022, the Navy announced that it had fired a hypersonic prototype round at White Sand Missile Range, which supposedly reached Mach 5 speeds. Several months later, the US Air Force launched its first hypersonic missile prototype off the southern coast of California. Development is slated to continue for the foreseeable future as the US works to outcompete the abilities of its adversaries. Do you think there should be a worldwide ban on developing atomic weapons? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. 2. M65 atomic cannon. In the years following World War II, the US and the Soviet Union engaged in a frenzied competition to outdo one another in terms of scientific achievements and military capabilities. These rivalries started as early as 1947, marking the beginning of the Cold War. One of the earliest American developments in the race for superiority was the M65 atomic cannon. The just over 85-ton, 85-foot-long weapon was produced in the early 1950s as a way to launch nuclear projectiles before missiles and rockets were available. At the time, it was the US Army's largest artillery weapon. Nicknamed Atomic Annie, the gun successfully test-fired a nuclear artillery shell at a range of 7 miles in 1953. Based on the results, the military moved ahead with the development of the M65 atomic cannon. However, the test would turn out to be the first and only time a nuclear shell was fired from a cannon. The M65 could be set up in as little as 12 minutes, and its transport vehicles could safely carry it at speeds of up to 35 miles per hour. At around 600 pounds, the weapon's 280mm shell was small for a nuclear weapon. But it was majorly destructive, as the test firing proved when it yielded a 15-kiloton explosion. Firing the M65 required a team of 5 to 7 operators, and the gun was capable of firing 2 to 3 rounds per hour. It had an effective firing range of approximately 20 miles and a muzzle velocity of 2,500 feet per second. 20 of the guns were produced at a cost of $800,000 each. The military deployed them to Korea and parts of Europe, and they were frequently moved in order to avoid being discovered and targeted by enemies. However, the M65 quickly became obsolete for several reasons. It was large, it had a limited range, and it required the development of nuclear shells that were compatible with existing artillery pieces. The US was quick to ditch the idea for the development of more mobile rockets, but it kept M65s in service as a prestige weapon until 1963, when they were replaced by tactical nuclear missiles. While its glory days were short-lived, some modern experts have argued that the M65 influenced the 1953 armistice that brought about a ceasefire to the Korean War. Throughout the Cold War, the Soviets also developed a handful of nuclear artillery pieces, including their own atomic howitzers and mortars. The largest Soviet nuclear artillery weapon was the Tu-A3 Condensator 2B, which was designed in the mid-1950s as a response to the M65. Measuring nearly 66 feet long and weighing 64 tons, the condensator was smaller than the M65, and it required a crew of 8 to operate. Each projectile weighed over 1,200 pounds and had a range of roughly 16 miles, which means that the ammunition was much larger than the M65's rounds, but they couldn't travel as far. There were several issues with the condensator. It was difficult to move due to its size, and it was too big to travel through most cities. The weapon was also complex, and it became obsolete by the time it was implemented, and it's been described by some as a failure. only 4 condensators were ever produced, and their service life was extremely short, lasting from 1956 to the mid-1960s. In the end, the USSR and the United States both agreed to disarm any remaining nuclear artillery shortly before the Iron Curtain collapsed. At least 7 M65s survive today and are on display in various places throughout the US, including the US Army Artillery Museum at Fort Sill in Oklahoma and the US Army Ordnance Training and Heritage Center in Petersburg, Virginia. 1. Type 94 Naval Gun. In 1934, Japan withdrew from the League of Nations and the Washington Naval Treaty, a post-World War I agreement that sought to prevent an arms race by limiting naval construction. The treaty restricted the size and power of naval ships, but imposed no rules on how many vessels a navy could have. Although World War II was still several years away, tensions between Japan and the United States were already brewing due to the increasing American military presence in the South Pacific. An armed conflict was looming, and Japan wanted to be prepared. They knew they couldn't compete with the number of battleships the US Navy had at its disposal, but they were now free from the limits of the Washington Naval Treaty. And so, they set their sights on building massive ships that would be capable of engaging multiple enemy battleships at once. The 862-foot-long Yamato and its sister ship of similar size, the Musashi, were built in complete secrecy despite their gargantuan size. Construction began in 1937 and both ships were launched in 1940. The Yamato was commissioned in 1941 in Hiroshima Bay, just a week after the brutal attack on Pearl Harbor. This was carried out in a deliberately subdued and inconspicuous manner to avoid tipping off the Allies about the ship. As the biggest battleship ever built, the Yamato was at least 30% larger than any of its enemy ships in terms of displacement. But size alone would do little to advance Japan's war agenda, and a big ship would have served little purpose without big guns to go along with it, so the Japanese planned accordingly. Both the Yamato and the Musashi were equipped with the largest gun ever fitted to a naval ship, known as the Type 94 Naval Gun. Each weapon was over 69 feet in length and weighed over 162 tons. These guns were also capable of firing explosive and armor-piercing shells up to 26 miles. The guns were mounted in 3 gun turrets, with each ship equipped with 9 Type 94 guns. Each individual mounted turret weighed 2,510 tons, roughly the equivalent of an average-sized destroyer at the time. In addition to its sheer firepower, the Type 94 had another advantage. Unlike other large naval guns of the era, it was capable of firing special anti-aircraft shells called Sanshiki, otherwise known as beehive rounds. They contained shrapnel and explosive materials, and were designed to create a barrage of fire that would make it difficult for attacking aircraft to navigate and see through. American pilots, however, regarded the ammunition as little more than a pyrotechnics display, and certainly didn't consider it to be an effective anti-aircraft weapon. But it still couldn't have been pleasant to be targeted with a 3,000-pound exploding shell, which typically burned for 5 seconds while spewing 16-foot-long flames. Out of the 27 Type 94 guns that were made, only 18 were ever used. And while the Yamato and Musashi served in the war, neither vessel was involved in any battleship-to-battleship engagements. And, in the end, both vessels were sunk by Allied forces, proving that having the biggest and best guns is no guarantee of victory. Which of these super weapons did you find the most fascinating? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.